Aaron Dykes for True Stream Media. Now, this is a story with wide ranging implications. It's very technical. I'm going to try to simplify it because it's a story about Agent Orange, about ongoing environmental contamination, and it's also about the contaminated ties between city officials, between media entities, between the government, the army and military, and even between pesticide companies like Monsanto. After all, Agent Orange became notorious during the Vietnam War because it was used as an herbicide and defoliant to try to destabilize the Viet Cong enemy. It was used to destroy the trees that they were allegedly using for cover and to try to destroy the food crops that were supporting their population and the populations that were aligned with them. But Agent Orange had a lot of notorious and very hurtful side effects and injured about 3 million Vietnamese people and tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers and other allied forces. And it caused cancer and other health effects and also passed along to future generations birth defects and became notorious. Agent Orange was so named because of the orange stripe around the barrel that they used to disperse it from helicopters over the trees, as this picture shows. It's made up 50% from 2,4,5-T and the other 50% between 2,4-D. And 2,4-D is still fresh in the news because it's a pesticide that has been reapproved by the USDA for widespread usage in American crop growth. It's coming to a farm near you. That's what Daisy Luther wrote back on January 6th. And 2,4-D has been flagged for its own role in a lot of health effects. Other people say, never mind that, it's not an issue, it's only the 2,4,5-T. Either way, it's a half and half component of the deadly Agent Orange, and they're going to be using it more and more because the new wave of genetically modified crops won't just be resistant to Monsanto's Roundup, they will also be resistant to secondary pesticides, one of the most common of which will be 2,4-D. Others are things like glufosinate and other things that are hard to pronounce and which the public knows little about, but they're going to be stacked in GMOs and in order to deal with the superweeds issue because glyphosate alone isn't doing it. The weeds are becoming resistant, so they're trying to double down and add new types of pesticide to help farmers deal with it, and the plants are going to resist it. Anyway, the Agent Orange continues to be an issue in the Chanute area, outside of the former Chanute Air Force Base and near the small town of Rantoul, Illinois, which is about 2 hours south of Chicago, maybe kind of southwest there. There's Chicago up in the corner, and then down here is Rantoul, Illinois, and the accompanying former Air Force Base. And there's alleged contamination with this Agent Orange, but it's disputed because the base didn't officially dispense it. It was dumped in a nearby landfill site, which was later turned into a man-made lake. And there's all kinds of controversy surrounding this stuff, but very important controversy because Agent Orange and its 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D combine to make an unintentional byproduct of dioxin, a persistent organic pollutant, one of these pollutants that can directly cause cancer and other problems, but does not break down in the environment. Wherever it goes, wherever it stays, it continues to be a threat unless it's properly cleaned up. And you can see here on the Veterans, U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs websites, all the diseases that are officially linked with Agent Orange. And it's a long list. Things like leukemia, diabetes, Hodgkin's disease, heart disease, multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Parkinson's, on and on, prostate cancer, respiratory cancer, sarcomas, all kinds of stuff, and of course children with birth defects. It's a big deal. Even Lou Gehrig's disease. There's a lot of people being treated through the Army officially in the Veterans Affairs dealing with Agent Orange and the fallout. Here's a site looking for people just from the Chanute Air Force Base who may be dealing with Agent Orange related health diseases. But this controversy came up because officials dispute the claim that Agent Orange was ever used at Chanute. despite the fact that documentation has come forward from one Doug Rocky. He's a retired Army major. He served in Vietnam in the first Gulf War. He's one of the leading experts on depleted uranium and the use of Agent Orange, but he's definitely a polarizing lightning rod figure for many who see him simply as a conspiracy theorist, who say he's overstating claims or doesn't know what he's talking about. And that's up for you to discover. But he does hold a PhD, and he's listed here on the Chanute Restoration Advisory Board for the Air Force. They officially list him, they acknowledge him, and they have a little article about Meet Doug Rocky, a Chanute Restoration Advisory Board member. He is considered an expert in environmental education compliance, and he's part of this cleanup at this former Air Force base. So if anyone's an expert on what happened with Agent Orange, it might be Doug Rocky. But they ignored him at all these public meetings and even kicked him out, and apparently had him they tried to arrest him, according to this journalist's account. Doug Rocky came forward with a source who now lives in Florida but who worked at the Chanute Air Force Base, named Michael Glassner, who gave him a whole bunch of documents about what happened with Agent Orange and Heritage Lake. And bear with me, this is a long saga. He's got reports about them dumping barrels of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, the components of Agent Orange, by the drumful in what later became the man-made lake Heritage Lake. It's potentially contaminated, but they don't properly admit that. Now, Michael Glasser himself is considered 100% disabled. He has a 100% disability due to his personal use of Agent Orange, and this is verified through the Veterans Affairs, who have him listed as having prostate cancer, as having bladder cancer, as having urethra cancer, all as a result of his exposure to hazardous chemicals during his service as an apprentice engineer and entomology specialist in Civil Engineering Insect and Rodent Control Division from 1963 to 1964. In other words, he used pesticides, including Agent Orange, to deal with insects and rodent control, and now he's got bladder, prostate, and urethra cancer, and he claims he was exposed to all kinds of insecticides and hazardous chemicals, ranging from DDT to malathion, diazinon, benzene, chloridane, preodine, and Agent Orange, all of which have their issues. And he also came forward with the documentation showing that he personally was involved in dumping this stuff into what became this lake. But that's just the beginning of the story. Bring in Bob Bajic. He's an independent journalist now who was working for the local Rantoul paper outside of Illinois, and he's got a whole personal saga here on the DC Bureau site about how journalism is about seeking the truth. That's why he wanted to be a journalist, and he thought he would do a great job exposing the truth and investigating important issues as part of his job as a full-time reporter for the Rantoul Press, a small weekly paper in this village, really, of Rantoul that's outside of this former Air Force base. But he quickly found that when he investigated the Agent Orange issue, he was blackballed and stonewalled and every other kind of blocked by the paper he worked for. His editors did not stand up for him. He was brushed back by community leaders. He goes on to name names. It's kind of a long saga. Different people met with him, convinced him to try to kill the story, asked him not to investigate it, delayed publishing his stories, ended up not publishing it, and by the end of it, they found a reason to fire him and claimed he was unprofessional, in large part because he was talking to Doug Rocky, who we've discussed is a very controversial figure, but is acknowledged by the Air Force itself as an expert in these issues. And it says here, reporter Bob Bajic is relying on information from RAB member and conspiracy theorist Doug Rocky. Mr. Bajic might consider that he is only as credible as his sources. And on the basis of talking to him and some other environmental activists, he was completely pushed back and not allowed to do his stories, and eventually pushed out of the picture altogether, and told directly by his editors that reporting on the Agent Orange issue was hurting the community. That reporting on potential environmental contamination was working against the best interest of the community. He upset every community leader in the town, and all the papers thought that he was making the town look bad. And this is just, you've got to go read this for yourself. It's a lot of details. But basically, how are we ever going to know the truth about what's going on in our world when even a small town dealing with potential contamination from what ultimately is a couple barrels of Agent Orange can't get to the bottom of the truth, can't even write about it, can't warn the rest of the community? They've obviously evaded doing a lot of official investigations because it's not something that they want to deal with. There's an Air Force Base involved. There's pesticide companies involved. The town's wanting to use the former Air Force Base and about 40 acres to grow crops on. They're wanting to grow food crops for private and commercial consumption on these old sites, and they're not doing all their homework on what the situation is. Of course, all these papers have their own accounts about how this is a non-story, how it was overblown, and how this reporter Bajic didn't do his homework, wasn't following rules, and was, quote, just trying to cause trouble and stir up expletive. He didn't represent the publications very well and embarrassed himself by angering everyone in the town, and especially the community leaders, mainly by doing the Chanute story and looking into the contamination. But what's the truth of it? The EPA, Illinois Environmental Protection Agency site, has a whole page dedicated to the Chanute Air Force Base site, and talks about the dumping of chemicals at 4 different landfills, and at least 2 of them received or allegedly received or may have received 55-gallon drums of 2,4-D, 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetatic acid, you try pronouncing that, and or 2,4-T, the 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, as well as other chemicals in these landfills, and one of these sites became Lake Heritage. And at one point they didn't allow people to fish. At another point the Air Force only allowed them to catch and release. And finally they claimed there was no harm to human health and the environment, so they allowed people to fish with no restrictions on the site. But there's obviously more to the story. If we can't get the story on this, how can we know the story about if it's safe to use these pesticides in general on crops today? If these pesticide companies should be allowed to run rampant the way they're doing? If we should look further into the use of government deploying these chemicals? And not only did they use them in Vietnam, by the way, they tested them on a lot of Air Force bases and surrounding communities during the Vietnam War period, and other chemicals during other periods. What are the total effects of those? Well, some of them haven't been investigated, others never have been. And this is just one example of the crazy cover-ups that can happen when you try to ask what basically are considered the wrong questions. I'm from an area with the Dow Chemical Company, BASF. There used to be a Monsanto site. There used to be an Amoco site, a BP site, and other chemical companies. And I know from personal experience, those are topics that you don't investigate too closely, that they generally use a healthy public relations image, because those companies provide the majority of jobs and support for the towns in general. They're not about to report controversial things about those places. Doesn't matter what they claim their ties to them are. They're not about to make them look bad when they're the backbone economically of the community. And it looks from all appearances like that's what's happening in Rantoul. And you can go read the accounts for yourself. I'll leave it there. Big environmental questions. Thanks for watching.